Hello, everyone. Hello, 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 everyone. This is the sort of entrances that Venerable has been making all week, which is fantastic. So I'll just quickly introduce Venerable Robina Court, not that she needs introducing, and thank you all for coming. Fantastic. It's great to see so many of you here for this weekend, which I'm sure is going to be very enlightening, embracing your delusions in the middle of what can only be termed as one of the busiest places in Sydney, the Cross. So,
all right. Well, I'll just start with a little prayer. It's expressing two thoughts. Sort of, and the Tibetans talk about before you do anything, you sort of state your motivation, and we're going to talk about this because what goes on in your mind. What underpins our actions is what determines the quality of our actions. We'll talk about this. So we're just sort of, anybody in the room who's already a Buddhist, the first two lines are expressing our reliance on the Buddha, reminding us of that. And the second two lines can be for all of us. It's stating, the Tibetans say setting your motivation. We might say stating our purpose, In other words, why are we here today? So we're going to listen. Maybe all for different reasons, but let's kind of make it a unified reason. Maybe we can think we're going to listen to see if there's some tools we can take from this. This is practical. This is advice. You don't have to take the advice, It's just hearing it as advice. Advice for what? Well, two things. One, advice to help us become less neurotic, less fearful, less depressed, less angry, less whatever, the miserable stuff, for our own sake. But also for the sake of others, because we all live together in this insane asylum called the planet, and because we are all intensely social beings who interact enormously. So it's a practical thing to see if there's some tools. And I like to say you can be a 1% Buddhist. You can take 1% of this. If it's practical, you take it. It's completely fine, That's the idea. Sing this little prayer in Tibetan, if I can. Seem to be running out of a voice. Sangye chadang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye chadang soke chognam la jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chonyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye chadang soke chognam la Jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chunyen gipe sonam ki drola penjir sangye dropa shok. Well, I think there's so many ways of entering into Buddhism. Doorways, and indeed, because around the world there are so many kind of ways of presenting Buddhism. So here I'm talking from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective. This is my teachers, my lineage, and in particular style within Tibetan Buddhism. It's all of Buddhist teachings, but it's kind of framed and described and emphasized in different ways according to the culture, according to the tradition, So, and also according to the person. Because my things, since I'm a little girl, I've always kind of wanted I'm not trying to sound noble, the big picture, but I've always wanted to understand the whats and the whys and the who and the wow and why happiness and why suffering and what is God and what is this and blah, blah, I never kind of went the scientific approach, but it usually ended up becoming sort of social and political, that ended then up for me when I was about 29 or 30, hearing these Tibetan Buddhists, So this is the framework, if you like, the framework I'm using for understanding myself, therefore understanding how to, understanding myself and therefore understanding others, and which is the wisdom wing. A bird needs two wings, Buddha says. All the nuts and bolts of all the Buddha's teachings are the wisdom wing, how to sort yourself out so that we can do the compassion wing, which is helping others. So what's the big picture then? The big picture, would include, from the big picture point of view, Buddhism is a vast, it's a vast, coherent, within itself, of course, coherent, world system, which might an understanding of the universe. We might not think it's that. A cliched understanding of Buddhism is a sort of you meditate, you watch your breath or something, you learn to be mindful. That's kind of a cliched view of what Buddhism is. Well, it's an aspect of it. And often because of there's not a lot of understanding, even among Buddhists, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about even what mindfulness meditation is and why you would want to do it. So, okay, the central point I'd say the essence, right down to the essence, the central one point that it all comes down to, whether you take it from the metaphysical, from the psychological, the philosophical, or even the religious, whatever, all of these, taking it from these points of view, they come to one thing: Buddha's own experiential findings about the mind and its nature and what its potential is. That's it. That's the essence of it, actually. All of Buddhism comes to that. So the first thing about the Buddha, which we kind of know in a cliched sense, but if we follow it through, if we look at the implications of this, it's kind of interesting. Who is this person, you know? Who is this Buddha? So it was interesting. I noticed around the world, because that's what I happen to do, I go around the world talking to different groups of people about Buddhism, that we all actually ask the same question. There's only one question ever I've had once. And that's from a scientist in Nelson in New Zealand. And he said, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? Which is a completely valid question when you take the assumption that religion is information coming from a superior being on high who created the universe, which is to say most religions, the big picture religions, the main institutional ones we know about, the Christian teachings, the Muslim teachings, you know, there's a creator who created me, created the laws, who is to be obeyed, who punishes, who rewards, whatever level you understand. That's a fundamental assumption, isn't it, about religion? So then we can be forgiven for thinking that also is Buddhism. I mean, I'm a nun. I sang a prayer. It sounds like religion. You ask a Tibetan, are you religious? They'll say, yep. Oh, you believe in God. Who? Never heard of a creator, you know. That's one of the fundamental points. So it's important just, I think, conceptually to get that clear, that then that would be, this is, I think, a very powerful then basis for how to listen to Buddha's teachings. So for the example I used, and I said this to that scientist, when I said to the scientist, nobody revealed the teachings to him, I said they came from his own experience. I said, actually, Buddha is more like Einstein than to any, you know, teacher in another religion. And he was quite shocked. And I said, and this is the point, that Buddha, everything that is called Buddhism, that's valid, I mean, lots of people make things up because people think it's religion, anyone can say anything they like. It's kind of very rude, really. But if it's valid Buddhism, then necessarily it came from the mind, from the observation of a person called a Buddha. And Buddha, indeed, Buddhism would say that many people since that time have become a Buddha. This word that's used to refer to certain characteristics of the mind. And we'll go into this. So, in other words, I said, if I were Einstein here telling you about relativity, you wouldn't ask that question, would you? Who revealed the teachings about relativity to Einstein? This is really a crucial point, actually. And he said, of course he wouldn't ask that question. Well, he wouldn't, because we know very well Mr. Einstein was this clever fellow who used his own noggin, who observed certain things, it's what we call the physical, the external world, and came to his own conclusions about how things exist, didn't he, in a certain kind of framework. So he presents his quote-unquote teachings. He presents his findings. And we know very well that if I were Einstein, I would not say, you better believe me, baby. You would know that it was not revealed to me. It didn't come in a vision. I didn't have a dream about it. You would certainly hope I'm not making it up. In any of those cases, you'd chuck me out the door as a phony, you know. That's what we mean by science. Well, that, and it's surprising to us, just instinctively, that's exactly the same as the Buddha. Identical. He was a regular guy who used his own mind, and we're talking about the mind in a very different way here, and we're going to go into that. He's this regular guy who came to his own direct experiential observations about the universe, about, crucially, what the mind is, what its function is, what its potential is, and its role in the universe. Specifically, in daily life, its role in our pursuit of happiness and its role in our pursuit of avoidance of suffering. So it's quite a shock to hear this, you know, because we so assume that religion equals belief. And that's correct in the creative religions. It would be utterly inappropriate to get God to prove his point, or for you to attempt to prove God's point, because by definition, God, a creator, is necessarily superior, and that is how it is. And secondly, you don't think when you're a Christian that you're becoming God. This would be the worst kind of arrogance. But that's the point about the Buddha. He was a regular guy who became a Buddha. So, okay, what's a Buddha? Pretty reasonable question. So because we have no reference point for these concepts, well, the best we can do is hear them and see if we can kind of imagine it, you know. Because in our modern psychology, there is no equivalent to what Buddha's saying. Not even an atom of equivalence. So that's why we, again, assume it, because we can't prove it with our scientific views, if it has to be nonsense. No, it has to be a belief, you know. So for the Buddha, the Tibetan word for the word Buddha, this is kind of all the big picture now, okay? I'm giving you kind of a big picture as a background. Then we'll go into the specifics of how you apply this stuff and why you would apply it, you know. So the big picture, the goal, the potential, Buddha says, of every... Okay, got a chair? Okay. The potential, Buddha has found that the natural potential of every consciousness, every mind, and these words virtually in Buddhism are used synonymously, is to, and this is implied by the etymology of the word in Tibetan for the word Buddha, Sangye. So Sang implies the utter eradication from one's consciousness of all neurosis, all ego, all fears, all anger, all attachment, jealousy, low self-esteem, whatever words you want for the miserable stuff that we all utterly are familiar with. Buddha has found, he's done this job himself. He's not asking us to believe him, just like Einstein. Basically, Einstein says, this is what I've found, here's my methodology, over to you, babies, now go prove it for yourself. Buddha's saying the same, okay? So he said this first syllable, sang, implies the utter eradication from one's mind of all nonsense, all ego, all fears, all the dramas. So this already is an utter shock to us, because we so completely take it as a given, don't we, in our philosophical materialist views of the mind. That's just a statement of the type of philosophy we have, the materialist philosophy. You've got the Christian one, you've got the Muslim one, you've got, you know, the Buddhist one, you have the materialist one. They're viewpoints, aren't they, that exist in the world, and are interpretations about how things exist. So from that perspective, they've got all equal status, although we as material philosophers, philosophical materialists, don't think so. We've got this arrogance that really believes we're right and all the other idiots are foolish, you know. We've found the truth, which is kind of arrogant. But that's like any fundamentalist person, isn't it, you know? A fundamentalist Christian, a fundamentalist Buddhist, fundamentalist Catholic, believe they've got the truth, everyone else is a fool, you know. So anyway, this first syllable, sang, implies the utter eradication of all the nonsense from our mind. Then the second syllable, equally radical, is that Sangye, Buddha, that we can develop to perfection all the goodness, the clarity, the intelligence, the joy, the kindness, compassion, these positive qualities. So these simple words, which are not the stuff of our modern psychology. We've made up these fancy terms, haven't we not, in modern psychology. These are still the terms that all the Christians use. There used to be some of the naughty ones are called the 7 deadly sins, weren't they? Which is why we get nervous when we talk about morality. You know, in modern psychology, we don't like the concept of morality because it sounds like you're judging somebody, and we're very nervous about doing that. Well, Buddha still uses these concepts, you know. That Buddha has found, from his own experience, that this is what's possible, that he has accomplished this. So that's insane, meaningless, absurd, and nonsense if we take the view that our mind is the brain. Very clearly. I mean, we tried cutting out bits of the brain in the 1930s, and I think we discovered it didn't work. So if we think the mind is the brain, what Buddha's saying is meaningless nonsense, isn't it? It's fantasy. So then that means if we're interested in Buddhism, we have to then step out of our own assumption of what the mind is. This is what we have to do if you want to, and look at what he says the mind is. Because believe me, he does not say it's the brain. He doesn't argue we don't have a brain. He doesn't argue it doesn't play a role, but it's a whole different way of speaking. It's a bit like if you're an allopathic medical person and you suddenly one day hear about these weird, wacko Chinese people who stick needles in you. First, of course, it's idiocy, isn't it? It's nonsense. And some people still, even though they hear reports of how it's a 5,000-year-old system that does have validity and people benefit from it, still if you've got a very fundamentalist, concrete mind in the allopathic system, you'll think they're a bunch of idiots. I mean, we're all like this. We're very arrogant in our own systems, you know, whatever those systems are. So if you want to understand acupuncture, you can't squeeze it into the allopathic system because it's like a different language. We understand this, you know. It's like trying to understand Indian music in the context of Western classical music. It's a different set of theories, a different set of assumptions. You've got to open your mind and step out of your own and listen freshly to this new language. Well, that's exactly, to really understand, if you want to, Buddhism at a deeper way, a deeper level, one needs to do that. There's certain levels of Buddhism, you don't even have to think about this stuff. And that's the stuff, that's where the meeting point in these days, people doing mindfulness meditation, you know, relating it to the brain. It's perfect, totally perfect, nothing wrong with that. But I like the big picture. So you came today, I'm sorry, you have to listen to how I do it, you know, what to do. Do you understand? And let's hope there's something useful. If it's not, you're allowed to walk out. It won't be insulted, I promise. So, okay, so the Buddha's view, just out of interest, then we'll go into the day-to-day application of this stuff, which is where you don't, where in the end, I don't care if you think, like I say, I don't care if you think your mind is in your toenail. I don't care where you think it is. There's masses of this stuff that we can apply in daily life, which we're going to get to, which is the point. But I want to give a bit of the background. So as far as the Buddha is concerned, and again, remember, this is not from revelation. It is not from on high. Let's hope he didn't make it up. That would be an utter fraud, And that he's not speculating. Just like Einstein, if he was speculating, well, I think it's maybe this, not sure, no, not sure. You don't ask him to go out the room and be shut up until he's got his truth clear, until he's clear about what is right and wrong. And that's one of the interesting points. We're so nervous about saying what's right and wrong when it comes to religion. We're happy to say what's right and wrong when it comes to science, because we know that no one's trying to shove it down our throats. Well, that's the approach here. I'm hoping that Buddha is confident in saying what he's saying, and then gives all his methodology and gives his reasoning, I hope he is. Otherwise, he better shut his mouth until he's clear. But he's not asking us to believe him. This is the most fundamental point. Most fundamental. And that's why I always like to say, very consciously, that consciously have chosen to use Buddhism as my working hypothesis. And that's a perfect phrase. That's a perfect approach. But we tend to say belief. You're going to see, I'm not trying to catch you out. Oh, you mean Buddhists believe this and Buddhists believe that, Buddhists believe this. You'd never say, oh, I believe in mathematics. You'd never say, I believe in relativity. You would never say that. Even if you've never proven it yourself, technically it means you believe in it until you've proven it. But we never say belief, So it's kind of interesting. So, okay, then the Buddha says first, your consciousness, your mind, is not a function of the brain. So just out of interest, by the way, one of the books I edited, one of my jobs is to edit Buddhist books. So one of the books I edited a couple of years ago that's now available is by my teacher Lama Zopa, and it's about how to help at the time of death. Death is a big deal in Buddhism, taking the Buddhist view about the mind, which we'll go into. I read at the time I was editing this book, I read a book by this American medical journalist, Nick Teresi. He's a very funny fellow. From his own side, he's an atheist, but it was about he's done masses of research in the States in particular, now finding all the enormous contradictions and confusions and conflicts that are coming up in the medical profession as a result of whatever the polite word is for farming organs. What do they call it? What's the polite word? Huh? That's what they use, is it? Okay. So enormous conflict now about what is life and what is death. When does life end and when does it not end? What is it, in other words? What is the consciousness? What is life? And it's marvelous, I think, that's coming because these people are questioning, Like he had a whole chapter on people who have out-of-body experiences when they're completely unconscious on the operating table. It's very interesting things, conflicts and problems because people coming back to life. Over the centuries in all cultures there are reports of people who come back to life, as we say, after they've been technically called dead, knocking on the coffin, this kind of thing. Of course it doesn't fit in our materialist model, so we kind of shrug our shoulders and think it's weird, So anyway, one of the doctors quoted in this book, he said, I can say now with certainty that consciousness is not a function of the brain. I have not got a clue what it is, but this much I can say. So I think from this perspective it's marvelous. There are these meetings of different views now. The Dalai Lama the last 30 years there's an organization in America on their website, mindandlife.org, organizing these amazing meetings of the best brains in the West and the best brains in the Tibetan Buddhist world who study this stuff in a big, from the big picture point of view. Marvelous findings now. Many of the findings about neuroplasticity are coming from some of these meetings, Really marvelous, mindandlife.org. And all their meetings have been published. And we had a conference in San Francisco, 2008, and we had some of the best people in this field from Harvard, from Stanford, from Berkeley. People have been affected by the meetings with the Dalai Lama. Really amazing, real insight coming from the Western side, because we are very ignorant about Buddhism, to find that this very articulate, interesting, fascinating view about what consciousness is and how it functions and so on and so forth, So, okay, the Buddhist view, first of all, mind is not your brain. Second, it doesn't mean the brain doesn't play a role. Utterly, that is evident. But it's not a function, as that doctor said, not a function of the brain. I think it's a really crucial point. Second, this is a shock to us. It is not the handiwork of someone else. Now if we're materialists, it's an absolute default truth that Mummy and Daddy gave me my mind. Naturally, because we think the mind is the brain, or at least an equivalent there, then they gave me anger, gave me love, gave me compassion, gave me psychosis, gave me depression, gave me being good at football or music. This is a default, isn't it? And I think this is an assumption in all our science and absolutely there for our psychology. And in our own mind, it's a default. Why am I angry? I've got to see what happened in the past. We look into the past looking for a needle in a haystack. What happened that triggered or caused my anger or caused me to be good at music? This is just so unquestioned. So this is kind of a shock to hear this view, and we're going to be discussing this. This point is central in Buddhism, and therefore central in the way we apply these approaches to life, you know. That we're not the handiwork of mummy and daddy. That yes, they gave us a brain. Yes, they gave us a body. They worked really hard to get that egg and sperm together, didn't they? Either in the Petri dish or in the womb, you know. But the Buddha would say they gave me a body, no problem. But they absolutely do not give me my love, my kindness, my compassion, my psychosis, and anything else. Equally, Buddha would say we're not the handiwork of a superior being. Buddha even uses the term superior being, Arya being. Mr. Hitler misused that. Aryans, you know, superior being in Sanskrit. And Buddha even uses that, and we can all become one, but again, he has a different definition, clearly, from the Christians and the Muslims.